Constitution Day program. I am Professor Tracy Thomas. I'm the director of the Center for Constitutional Law here. The Center for Constitutional Law is one of 4 centers established by Congress in 1986 for the commemoration and research on constitutional issues. So there are 4 in the country, us, Drake, Howard, and South Carolina, and really only Drake and us still have programming and using that national resource. We host lectures once a semester. We host a conference in the fall. We have 5 affiliated faculty that do research and speaking to the media on, although breaking constitutional issues, which are constant these days. And we have a certificate for students, kind of a minor, like a minor and undergrad, kind of focus your studies on constitutional law. So there's a lot of resources to educate and really do research on these issues. Constitution Day, you may or may not know, is a national holiday. It's established by Congress officially in 2004 to commemorate the founding of our U.S. Constitution, which was September 17th. So that's why it's always sort of around mid-September. And Constitution Day, the law, mandates that all publicly funded institutions have programming. So technically we have to do this, but we love to do this. So we love to do these programming to really, obviously these are issues we're all thinking about and always thinking about the courts and law school and what these issues are. You may not know, I did not know until recently, that the origins of Constitution Day are from Ohio. And they're from Louisville, which is like 20 minutes south of us down here in Canton. In the early 1950s, there was a woman, Olga Weber, in Louisville, who petitioned to have a Constitution Day, a commemoration of the Constitution, and she petitioned her city. So Louisville did it first. Then she petitioned the state, so then the Ohio General Assembly in 1952 passed Constitution Day. It gets morphed with what at the time Congress had was Citizenship Day, which has some other overtones, and then it merges in 2004 to be a national holiday. So Louisville is Constitution Town. We are Constitution State, and we are sort of really the inheritors of this idea of really trying to think about our Constitution in a meaningful way. I'd like to introduce our speaker. What our speaker is going to do, I'm going to introduce him, and then he's going to read a little bit from the book, and then we're going to have a moderated Q&A, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So I'm pleased to introduce to you today Martin Siegel. Martin is an attorney and an adjunct professor at the University of Houston Law School. He graduated from the undergraduate at the University of Texas. He attended Harvard Law, and yes, in the same class as President Obama and Neil Gorsuch. I know, have to add that. He clerked on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit in New York City and worked for Judge Kaufman, who is the topic of his book talk today. He was then an assistant U.S. attorney in New York, a staffer on the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. He's worked at firms in D.C. and Houston, and now his own firm specializing in appellate litigation. At Houston Law, he teaches American legal history and the appellate civil rights clinic. Sept. I introduce to you Martin Siegel.
Okay, yes. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate you doing that. I want to thank Professor Thomas so much for having me here today and the Constitution Center for sponsoring this talk. As Professor Thomas said, I'm just going to begin reading a little bit from the epilogue, which will give you a good flavor for the book. As she said, the book grew out of my experience clerking for Judge Irving Kaufman. The book's a biography of Judge Kaufman. And the prologue will give you a sense of where the book goes and what it covers. So just a few minutes, I won't keep you too long. Prologue to the funeral. On a freezing February morning in 1992, I left the tiny apartment I shared with an architect and his girlfriend near Washington Square and headed uptown. I was on a sad and surreal errand, my boss's funeral. He was a federal appellate judge on the bench for 40 years, and for the past 6 months I've been one of his 2 law clerks. Just out of law school, we analyzed cases for him, recommended how to rule, and wrote first drafts of the court's opinions. Heady stuff for 220-somethings still wheeling from bar exams. But now we were filing past NYPD officers into the Moorish opulence of the Park Avenue synagogue. We tiptoed around the dignitaries, former heads of the CIA, FBI, other judges, media bigwigs, and found seats in back. I don't remember much of the service, mostly I was people watching. Then came the moment no one there will ever forget. The rabbi, a white-haired eminence, was winding up a soft-spoken eulogy when out of nowhere someone behind me bellowed, "He murdered the Rosenbergs, let him rot in hell." For a split second it felt as if a bomb had detonated. The elderly grandees gasped, ducked, lurched. I recovered in time to turn around and see an old, shabby figure calmly stride out of the sanctuary. The rabbi, seasoned pro, recovered his own. After the service, out there on Madison Avenue, 2 or 3 people were parading in a little circle holding signs, picketing in the icy cold. I was dumbstruck, protesting a dead man from the grainy, gray and white yesteryear of the McCarthy era. I was 25, and to me they might as well have been screaming, "Remember the Maine." I couldn't believe actually living people still cared, still hated the man enough to find and infiltrate his funeral and hound him one last time, literally into the grave. Justice Felix Frankfurter once said that being forgotten is the fate of all but very, very few judges. At least my old boss, Irving Robert Kaufman, was one of the few. In 1951, Kaufman wrangled to get the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, charged with stealing the, quote, secret of the atomic bomb and handing it to the monstrous Joseph Stalin. He was 40, one of the youngest federal judges in America and only 16 months in office. During the trial, he often intervened in ways that helped the government. Upstairs in his chambers, he conducted secret ex parte meetings with prosecutors, including the infamous Floyd Abrams. No one knows what they discussed. Once jurors convicted, he deftly advertised his anguish over the sentence and alluded to solitary soul-searching in his empty, dimly lit synagogue. Quote, "I shall approach my task with deep humility," he'd written the president on his appointment, "for to judge man is almost a divine prerogative," end quote. Now the hour for judgment had come. But his lonely meditations didn't end in mercy. Instead, he condemned the young couple to die in the electric chair in Sing Sing and blasted them for nothing less than igniting the Korean War. Who knows what the millions more of innocent people may pay the price of your treason, he thundered before a spellbound Manhattan courtroom. Carried out 2 years later, despite a frenzied push for clemency that united Picasso and the Pope, the death sentences convulsed America and ratcheted up Cold War tensions. By then, bomb threats had driven Kaufman and his family from their luxurious Park Avenue apartment. The septuagenarian zealots stalking his memorial service were missing something, though. In the years that followed the Rosenberg case, the hanging judge became something few didn't know and predicted, a progressive stalwart. He was the first federal judge to desegregate a school north of the Mason-Dixon line. After President John F. Kennedy elevated the appellate bench, the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, then the second most important federal court in America, his opinions modernized the insanity defense, improved juvenile justice, reformed Attica-era prisons, and shielded conscientious objectors from the jungles of Vietnam. The grateful son of immigrants, he freed the, quote, man without a country, stranded on Ellis Island, and halted Richard Nixon's deportation of John Lennon on bogus drug charges. In a decision called the Brown versus Board of Education of Human Rights Law, he breathed life into a vague, dusty statute from 1789 and permitted victims to bring their foreign torturers to justice in American courtrooms. His greatest part was on the First Amendment, as he championed the press and free speech in the Pentagon Papers case, a landmark libel suit against 60 Minutes, and other path-breaking decisions. Again and again, civil liberties lawyers would think of the martyred Rosenbergs and blanch on learning Kaufman was one of the 3 judges assigned to decide the repeal, only to turn ecstatic when he ruled in their favor. Grace withheld from the Rosenbergs overflowed toward others, the weak, the excluded, the unpopular. So the fierce living passion aroused that day by the old dead Irving Kaufman poses a riddle about judicial schizophrenia. How did the man responsible for 2 of the most infamous executions in American history become one of the most illustrious liberal jurists of his time? The question is what two historians have called, quote, the enigma of the Rosenberg judge, a figure typically wrongly caricatured as nothing more than a minor, bloodthirsty supporting cast member in the morality play of McCarthyism. Kaufman's clamorous send-off also reflected the wages of an extraordinarily tumultuous judicial life, one produced by a superheated energy and frantic ambition. My entire career has been one dominated by a sense of urgency, he confided to a family member. In his first 4 decades, he rose from nothing to national hero. Those people thought the Rosenbergs got what they deserved, and newspapers and congressmen hailed his courage in defying communist bullying and lunatic death threats. Little seemed to block his path to what was called, quote, the Jewish seat on the U.S. Supreme Court. But gradually, over the second 40 years, the terror of atomic annihilation and red baiting dissipated, and a deferred and scornful howl went up over what had happened to the Rosenbergs. In the 1970s, the couple's orphaned sons came of age and led a new generation's crusade to expose the government's asserted framework of their parents. Charges made all too plausible by the stream of official lies in Vietnam and Watergate. When FBI records revealed that Kaufman's private dealings with the prosecution had occurred, it was suddenly 1953 again. Dogged by new threats and strident protesters, denounced in print, and faced with calls for impeachment, he lived under siege. It's haunting why the eternally young couple bubbled to the surface in defensive outbursts of people he hardly knew, and in a relentless, decades-long secret campaign to counter and muzzle critics. I saw it in the sad, creased, oxidized brown index cards I found on his desk in 1991, quoting praise from the Rosenbergs' lawyer almost half a century earlier. Life in this pressure cooker exacted its bitter toll. One of Kaufman's sons was in the synagogue that morning to say farewell. The two were absent. They had predeceased Kaufman after decades of substance abuse, paternal haranguing, and in one case, mental illness. Dominated by the husband she married at 19, Kaufman's wife Helen suffered her own travails, alcoholism, anorexia, and attempted suicide. Misery shadowed the family's gilded lives among New York's Jewish elite, and few in the know chalked that as a coincidence. For most who knew it, judging offers one of life's quieter, cloistered pursuits. By and large, judges lead unspectacular lives, wrote one profile of Revere Norman Hand in 1946. Quote, their careers, like broad plateaus, are unmarked by gullies and hills. For Kaufman, however, the judicial calling formed a backdrop to heartache and collateral damage. What began as dazzling and precocious self-made success, a sprint toward the summit of legal power, ended largely in self-inflicted tragedy, just as the letter writers and funeral figures wanted. This book aims to illuminate and explain the curious path from Sing Sing in 1953 to the progressive champion in 1992, a period when political and judicial liberalism also experienced great evolution, and when judges increasingly came to be seen as willing political actors. Mirroring, and sometimes propelling this transition, Kaufman began as a Truman-esque, quote, tough liberal, firmly statist and anti-communist. Anyone could see the large patches of want and inequality in society, and like others of his political persuasion, he thought government and court should address them. As a man who began empty-handed but gained wealth and power through law and government, he had great faith in and gratitude for America. By the end, though, his liberalism had morphed into something different. He consistently supported the broadest and newest conceptions of individual rights and civil liberties, making him an unlikely partisan for dissidents and outcasts. Early confidence in the government's capacity to bring about badly needed change and deference to its stances on national security and law enforcement gave way with skepticism and endorsement of litigants fighting the power of the state. And he was frank and unapologetic about the judge's duty to formulate and implement social policy at a time of growing backlash against that idea. Finally, beyond the larger forces lurks the man. Despite judges' importance, our system tends to anonymize them, from uniform black robes to Delphic pronouncements and legalese. Yet temperament and inner life are among the key forces that contribute to judicial outcomes, though almost all the attention usually goes to ideology or political background. As one legal philosopher said famously long ago, quote, there is no guarantee of justice except the personality of the judge. Or as Kaufman himself put it, justice is administered by human beings. And Kaufman, the man, defiantly refused to recede into bureaucratic obscurity. Judges, especially appellate ones, are usually thought of as reactive, dispassionate, reserved, Olympian, contemplative. For better and worse, Kaufman was the opposite. Active, hyper-energetic, combative, consumed with image and power hungry. At a bantamweight 5'4" he disappeared into his leatherback chair, leaving a head barely visible above the bench. This deep, loud, gravelly, heavily accented New York voice had to do the work, and it never failed to make itself heard. In court, the fleshy face with its broad and mashed up nose and curled down lower lip often formed what Roy Cohn called a, quote, intimidating leader. Until Gray emerged victorious in his 60s, his hair was thick and black and slicked back. He placed great stock in appearances, looking British and thinking Yiddish, and his dark three-piece suit was always well-tailored with cufflinks and pocket-squared boot. To those swarming under his thumb, clerks, secretaries, lawyers who didn't measure up, he was tyrannical, a grenade waiting to explode. One ex-clerk I called said simply, quote, "That was the worst year of my life, but I don't want to talk about it." Another cried in the bathroom so often that when Kaufman learned where she was, he decided she must be drinking too much water and ordered water banned from chambers. As for her co-clerk, Kaufman raised himself up on tiptoes and shouted in his face so loudly that the clerk thought to himself, "I think I'm going to hit this guy," and wondered if that was a federal crime. That was when Kaufman was 80, after a triple bypass and a year from death. Before I even started, I heard about the time he got a call from security downstairs, after which he quietly put on his coat and left the office. A few minutes later, a marshal called back and was astonished that one of the clerks picked up the phone. "Didn't the judge tell you about the bomb threat?" the man asked. Of course he hadn't. Kaufman had wanted them to keep grinding. Was that story true? Who knows? The point is, it was believable. Fundamentally, he was not a nice person, an earlier clerk acknowledged. Yet Dr. Jekyll was there too, always. To friends and peers, he was affectionate and dependable. A few law clerks adroitly navigated the tantrums and emerged close confidants with a powerful and eager backer in their corner. His eye could twinkle as he charmed listeners with jokes delivered with, quote, "the polish of a Catskills comedian," as one former clerk put it. Gregarious and charismatic, when he thought it was worth the effort, he could and did seize the spotlight in rooms full of more prominent people. In 1977, a reporter assigned to profile Kaufman found herself defeated and eventually gave up, telling her editor, quote, "I could not come to terms with all the ambivalent feelings Irving Kaufman provoked. A man with a devouring passion for publicity and one who also calls up a kind of sympathy for the raw nerves, the warmth that are also a part of him. This is the stuff from which novels are made, not Times Magazine pieces," end quote. Or as an anonymous lawyer summarized Kaufman for a guide to the federal judiciary once, quote, "He's courageous, outspoken, opinionated, articulate, usually right, and not much loved." Memoranda between judges at the Second Circuit were addressed to recipients using their initials. Kaufman was IRK, Irk. Everyone agreed it fit perfectly.
You can all see this. I know it's very formal. Sit down there. All right. So you'll see after this talk, we do have the book in the lobby available for sale and for the author to sign if you're interested in that. And really, it's been getting really great reviews. So I think some of the reviews will talk about it reads like a novel. You know, a lot of law doesn't always do that. It really gives you a sense of what does it mean to administer justice? What does it mean to judge? So we're just going to try to hit some of the highlights for you now. But I want to start with the process. You know, why are you writing a book? You're an attorney. You're busy. It's not a typical attorney venture. So why this book?
A lot of people ask that question, starting with my parents, wondering what I was doing. I always wanted to write a book about him, and that honestly started right after he died. Basically, after that funeral, which was such an eye-opening experience to me. I knew the Rosenberg case had been controversial, of course. I couldn't believe it still had the present reality, and it incensed people to the point where they'd show up at his funeral and literally picket the man's funeral. That was astonishing to me. And shortly after the funeral, my co-clerk was assigned, she left chambers, and secretaries left, so I was sitting there alone in Judge Kaufman's empty chambers for weeks. Did my NCAA late pool, did my taxes, had nothing to do. And then the guy from the Library of Congress showed up to take his papers. His papers are housed in the Library of Congress. So I mean, literally, as they're going out the door on the gurney, I wanted to sort of like grab them and So I always wanted to do this, and I began it in 1994, doing some preliminary research, and it's literally a project that took me 30 years to see through completion, but I had time in between jobs, or when work was less pressing, or I went through a great period of about 3 months when I was going to wake up early in the morning and do some writing, and before work, and that didn't last very long. And finally, somewhere around 2015, 2016, I figured, look, I've done a fair amount of work, but I'm not going to finish this unless I really take time off fully. So I have my own practice, so I awarded myself a sabbatical, and it took a couple of years to finish. So I just, it's also it's genetic, it's the amateur historian in me. My father was a historian, and he wanted, I think, to sort of subtly discourage us from getting graduate degrees in history, my brothers and me, and point us toward something removed from like law school. And so he would say, well, look, you don't have to be a professional historian to write history. Anyone can study with point to Barbara Tuchman, for example, someone of that earlier era, widely known popular historian. So I think that's something that I had this sort of urge in me, and I always wanted to do that, and this was the subject that we became.
Right, so now you mentioned the Rosenbergs, and that's what the editors like to pull out as kind of the hook here. But tell us a little, remind us again of the Rosenbergs, and why, you said it interested you in the funeral, why did that also interest the editors as the way they went to frame this?
Well, that's interesting because the case does certainly interest me, and that's what Judge Kaufman, far and away, is most known for, is the Rosenberg case. Having said that, I did not set out to or want to write a book about the Rosenbergs because there are several books about the Rosenberg case, and about whether they truly were spies, and evidence against them, and about McCarthyism in that time. There's a separate book about the saga of the Rosenberg case in the Supreme Court. It had an extremely weird sort of path into the Supreme Court that dishonored that court. It's not exaggerated to say. So there's plenty written about the Rosenberg case. I really wanted to write more about the rest of his life, and with all these other cases, became prominent in civil rights, and civil liberties, and judicial administration. But of course, you can't ignore the Rosenbergs, and I wanted, to the degree I was interested in that, more than just the case, I wanted to show how it affected his life and the rest of his life. The case truly did haunt him, and we're in the prologue, literally to the end. I think in your question about the editors, they recognize that's what's known about them. And if it were just, hey, here's a book about a kind of prominent Second Circuit judge no one's heard about, then it would have been even harder to find publishing. So yeah, it's a weird paradox. You emphasize the Rosenbergs, but I wanted to focus on other things, but you have to emphasize them.
And you foreshadow in the prologue that later that he does sort of this arguably anti-civil rights decision in Rosenberg, but then becomes, as you say, a very progressive liberal civil rights judge and decision. Explain that, and then why do you think? How do you explain this shift?
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was really, as I said, the Rosenberg sentences and the Rosenberg prosecution starts out as a popular, and certainly widely popular. The public thought they were guilty, the public did not. For the most part, the sentences were conservative. For over a couple of years, before the sentences were carried out, opposition did begin to grow. There was this worldwide movement for clemency. Even so, I don't think it ever had full popular support, but a segment, a growingly sizable segment of American society began to see that as an injustice, that the sentence is too severe. And so for that reason, he was sort of reviled on the left in American society, in the American political world. And that's what began to change in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. Not that the perception had been changed very much, but this is sort of, he had been known, as I said in the prologue, as a kind of statist, as someone who favored the government, certainly in criminal cases and in other cases. And that began to evolve in the 60s and 70s. And I think the reason for that were many. First of all, he's following, that's happening generally in liberalism, and the Warren Court is leading this revolution, and he's following that to some degree, although in other places he's leading it, sort of out in front of the Warren Court, even in areas like poverty law and habeas corpus decisions and things of that nature, certainly First Amendment law. So part of it are the times, the knock on Judge Kaufman. And for example, I interviewed Linda Greenhouse for this book because she had covered Kaufman. She really immediately gave me this thesis. The knock on him is that he had become a liberal to atone for the Rosenbergs case. And that there's sort of two ways of looking at that. One is that even his atonement was insincere. He just wanted to remain in the good graces of Upper East Side polite society, and he remained a favorite of the New York Times. He had a long-time relationship with the New York Times, the publisher, the executives there. And then there's a more sincere version of that theory, which is he really did want to atone for the case. I don't think that's true. I don't think he ever thought the Rosenberg case was something that needed atonement. I do think it's true that he loved his image as a leading liberal, as someone who outlets like the New York Times love. But I think the liberalism was sort of always there, and the Rosenberg case took him off track. And I'll sort of just quote if I can, kind of my favorite thing that I found along these lines. This was in his papers, very little in his papers about his life before becoming the judge, before being on the bench. This was a sort of hand-typed up set of remarks. The kind of remarks that there was no caption on it. It wasn't clear what the remarks were intended for, but it read like something you would say at a congratulatory reception. Your friends or colleagues have helped you to honor you for just being appointed to the bench. So he's talking about that. So let me just on that for 1 sec. This is what he says. As I look around, my mind goes back to my early youth, the son of immigrants. And I promise you and all my other friends that I shall endeavor and hope to be privileged to make it a lot easier for those who are struggling like I did 20 years ago. Only in such a fashion can I reward the faith placed in me by this great distinction. So that really jumped out at me because he's saying when he's going to become a judge, not I'm going to administer equal justice under the law, or I'm there to be fair and impartial, all the kind of the things, the values we associate with being a judge. He's saying, I'm going to become a judge to help people who are struggling like I was 20 years ago. So I think that impulse toward the little guy and toward correcting injustice, which really does appear later in his career, I think it was always there in a way. And this was also this note, when I found it, stood out for me because there are almost no references elsewhere in his speeches or public writings to having grown up as an impoverished, struggling son of immigrants. I think that embarrassed him. And family members sort of conveyed that to me too. He quickly gained wealth and prominence, very quickly lodged himself on Park Avenue, and I think he wanted the world to think he'd always been on Park Avenue. That's kind of how the family saw it. This stood out. This is who he really was.
Interesting, really interesting. And that sort of segues, a lot of the reviewers have really picked up on the cultural context that's in the book, sort of the Jewish history, the differences of Jewish tribalism and different sort of in New York City. So let's talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
How did and also and how he didn't go to the Catholic hospital.
Yeah, right. That kind of his role in the Jewish community and the role of the Rosenberg community, those are prominent features. And also interested me in his story. Going back to the first question, his young life was just standard issue textbook New York Jewish immigrant stories. The son of immigrants from South America 6 years before he was born. They lived in a tenement on the Lower East Side. He had a brother and sister, a big family. The family lore was that his mom sat him down in a tenement with his two brothers, all arrayed in front of her. And she looked at one of them and said, "You're going to be a doctor." And she looked at the middle son, and said, "You're going to be a dentist." And she looked at the one on the right, Isidore, not yet Irving, changed his name. Isidore, he looked at Isidore and said, "You like to talk, so you're going to be a lawyer." And what's remarkable about that is kind of, that story can be in almost any Jewish American family. But what's remarkable about it is they did become doctor, dentist, and lawyer, all to a T. It worked. So he raced through, he really benefited from New York public schools. He went to great public schools, including a great high school, Clinton High School, which is still a well-known high school in New York City. Graduated early, he's trying to get to work as fast as he can. But you're right, he made one key divergence from the typical Jewish story is if were Jewish and you wanted a free education in New York City, in the 1920s and 1930s, you went to City College of New York, CCNY, which in doing this I learned the actual nickname for that back at that time was Circumcised Citizens of New York. So he did not do that. He went to Fordham, which was kind of off the path, and he did that because his older brother had gone to Fordham. And why did his older brother go to Fordham? His older brother had gone to Fordham because he declared his older brother knew he was going to med school, and he didn't want to be just another Jewish guy applying to med school from CCNY. So he thought like Fordham would be kind of set him apart. So Kaufman went to Fordham. It was a great place for him. He always talked about the education he got there. It also worked to a T for him to get him in to the thing that really vaulted into some prominence, which was the U.S. Attorney's Office in the 1930s. Franklin Roosevelt had appointed a Catholic lay leader as U.S. Attorney, and that person's deputy had gone to Fordham. So even though Kaufman's educational background wasn't he got to an Ivy League school or he come to public high schools, suddenly being from Fordham right at that moment got him into the U.S. Attorney's Office very useful, and then he became more prominent. But you're right. I mean, it's the Rosenberg case that really makes him that's where his Jewishness becomes a public issue, because people began to feel one of the charges leveled against him almost immediately after the sentences. As this public opposition to their execution grows, one of the charges was, you are a Jewish judge and you have bent over backwards to prove Jewish American loyalty by being overly harsh to these Jewish defendants. And you would not have felt the need to impose the death penalty and crack down as hard as you did and see them executed if you weren't trying to prove Jewish American loyalty. That's a charge he contended with the rest of his life.
All right, so now my question, we talked about this. What things got cut from the book? What did they let you do in room for?
Well, too much.
Yeah,
Of course. I know you'll all find that 350 pages is far too short. You'll wish it was longer. No topic in particular got cut, but I would say all the topics that are here, a lot of the stuff around them got cut. So it's sort of embarrassing to admit, I've got an amateur's sort of interest in architecture and design. So I found myself, writing this book early on, obsessed with all the interiors that were relevant to the book. So I was researching the ship that brought his family over from England. From Galicia, from Poland, from Ukraine, they made their way to England, and they boarded the ship for America. And I became fascinated with the ships, and there were paragraphs on like the stateroom of the ship, and the beautiful, the inlay and the wood, and all of that. And then his father-in-law had this luxurious apartment on Central Park West, so I was searching the lobby of the apartment, and so after a while, things like that did not need to be. The publisher made sure that it
All right. So what are the key takeaways you hope everybody who reads the book takes away from it?
Well, as concerns the Rosenberg case, I guess, as I said, I didn't really set out to want to write a book only about the Rosenberg case, but I guess the way in which it is somewhat distinctive in the treatments of the Rosenberg case is that it hones in on the judge and the performance of the judge. Most books, and there are a lot of great books about the Rosenberg case, most books focus, as you expect, on were they guilty, did they really commit espionage? Was the sentence ultimately valid if we made it too harsh, but for no other reason than they were actually spies? As a lawyer, and none of the other books that I'm aware of about the Rosenberg case have been about lawyers, except for the one I first about Supreme Court, I was focused on the judge, and there were some of the critiques about his judicial performance valid. Or, as I mentioned in the prologue, there had been these ex parte contacts between Kaufman and the prosecution, which certainly to our ears sounds grossly unethical. But over the years, his defenders, when that information came out in the 1970s, had various kind of technical arguments about why it wasn't actually unethical or common at the time. So I wanted to sort of drill into that and really explore that in a way that so I guess that's part of it. Part of it also on the Rosenberg saga is what happened to him in the 1970s when this case kind of cranked that to light because the Rosenbergs were kids who had been raised by a different family, they had a different last name, they really, quite understandably, tried to almost hide out. They they meant, because their own family members wouldn't. And they were, as you would expect, wanted to disappear and trauma despite this experience. But by the late 1960s, they had sort of become of age, and they were in their 20s, and as they described it, they've written eloquently and at length over the years, multiple books and articles about this. They wanted to sort of claim their parents' legacy. There's a particular thing that jogged that, their book about it, they thought you would be using their parents' letters in a way that infringed copyright. So there was a sort of spur to that, but that led to a larger decision of we are going to devote our lives to proving our parents' innocence, proving that they were framed. And it was right at the time of, right after, in the middle of the sort of Vietnam controversy, then it was after Watergate, and the public was willing to believe that in government lies, there had been so much deception in those two incidents that when the Rosenbergs kids began charging the government lied and framed our parents, that found willing ears and receptive audience in a way that we wouldn't have, I think, earlier on. So the controversy came back to life, and evidence came out of Judge Kaufman's ex parte contacts, and suddenly, as I said in the prologue, he was under siege. There were tickets everywhere. There were calls for his impeachment, articles about it in the New York Times, op-ed pieces urging him to open his files. It really changed his life. So that part of the controversy interested me too. I guess the last thing I would say, to answer your question about a takeaway, is I became really interested in this idea of how does personality affect the judgment? Because that, in Kaufman's case, it really is an important factor. He was genetically an active person. He was a doer, and he wanted cases to accomplish things. He wanted his orders to change things. He wanted his cases done as fast as possible. He demanded orders out by the end of the week. He was a real doer. And so this idea, the conservative thinking back then, now it's originalism. Back then it was just judicial restraint, was sort of the tagline for the opposite way of being judged from the Warren Court era. Well, Irving Kaufman couldn't be restrained by anything. He was never a judicial restraint. He was never going to capture Irving Kaufman. He was active. And how did that personality, that activity, how does that affect how judges are? I think, as I say in the book, I think too often we focus on, what's the political party or what are the writings? Or sometimes we don't focus on what kind of person is it, and how would that affect the judge? In his case, it did.
Well, and I think for me in reading that was really one of the key things is, we put judges on pedestals and we think, historically that they're these moral, perfectly people, and they're just people, right? They're doing important things. And I think just being able to read something that's nuanced and complex, but includes all of that, we don't have to oversimplify things to really understand them and still appreciate the time. So, well, now it's your turn. So if anyone, we can open it up to questions to the audience if any of you have questions for Mark. I can start calling too. Or if you'd like to talk about something.
You think the vote is guilty?
I do get that question a fair amount. It's clear that Julius Rosenberg was a spy. That's clear now. And we know that because, as the government knew at the time, although not most people in the government, not most members of the prosecution, but the highest levels of the government was known in the 40s and 50s that we had broken the Soviet code. That's how we began pursuing this espionage ring. That if you guys have seen the movie Oppenheimer, there's a very minor character in it named Klaus Fuchs, who was a British, German originally, but from England, physicist who was at Los Alamos. And he was a member of this Soviet espionage ring that ultimately Julius Rosenberg was a member of too. Julius Rosenberg's code name was Liberal. They eventually discovered that Liberal was Julius Rosenberg. So he was guilty. You could argue about the sentence is disproportionate, with how important was the atomic information that was passed to the Soviets. There's a great debate about that. But there's no doubt that he was a Soviet spy. There is question about Ethel and Ethel's role in the conspiracy. The Venona tapes say almost nothing about Ethel. I think there's a reference that says, knows of her husband's work, and work was the euphemism for spying. It does not work, in other words. However, there's some other fragmentary things from Soviet archives that suggested she she was born law. Khrushchev's memoirs, for example, refer to getting help from the Rosenbergs for rural. At trial, the evidence that convicted her at trial came from her brother, who was also clearly a member of the spy ring, and he said that she typed up the notes that he brought back from Los Alamos about the bomb. Her brother was a low-level machinist at Los Alamos and did green glass. He did a crude sketch of part of the bomb and typed up he brought him some handwritten notes. And he claimed that Ethel typed up those notes. So the thing that put her in the conspiracy, because you have to take it, it's not enough to know there's a crime or a conspiracy, you have to take an overt act to be in the conspiracy. So the thing that put her in the conspiracy was typing up the notes, supposedly. In the 1990s, David Greenblatt admitted that that was a fabrication, and that he had committed perjury at that trial and lied about Ethel's role. In fact, his own wife typed up those notes. So in the end, the evidence of what, if anything, Ethel Rosenberg did to further espionage is murky and unresolved. I think it's widely agreed she knew about it. She and Julius were unquestionably diehard communists who approved of it, approved of the concept. But that's not enough, right? To be convicted, you have to do something. And that's the sort of greatest tragedy, I think, about the case is that she was treated identically with him. She never had a separate legal existence at that trial. She ostensibly had separate representation. There was nominally a separate lawyer for her, but their defense was sort of corporate, it was the same. She didn't, try to wrap your mind around this. She's on trial for her life in 1951. She did not get a separate closing. Her lawyer did not deliver a closing argument about Ethel Rosenberg. Weirdly, her lawyer did give a separate opening for her. It was very short, but oddly, it was more effective than the opening for Julius. But there was no separate closing for her. And she was just treated the same. Now, of course, she might bear some responsibility for that. The thinking is that there's a whole school of thought that the Communist Party wanted them to be convicted so that they would be martyrs to the cause. Both of them had every opportunity between conviction and execution in 1953 to tell the government what they knew, right up to the moment of execution. Literally, there were phone lines going to Washington in Sing Sing with the hope that they would confess at the very last minute. That he would confess to save her, that she would confess to not orphan their children. And one of those, I forget his name, but a high-level Atomic Energy Commission official later was quoted saying she called her bluff. They never would confess. So there is thought that she was not that she wanted to die, that's certainly not true, but that she didn't want to be treated differently in the case that her husband. They never gave any thought to confessing, for example, or admitting that this ring existed. So there's a lot of feminist scholarship around the Rosenberg case and the way in which her prosecution and treatment by her own lawyers was so sexist. And both the prosecution and Judge Kaufman thought of her, and this is created out of whole cloth, there's nothing in the record to support this, but created the notion that she was the mastermind. There's no evidence to support. She was older than Julius, and it is possible that she was involved in the Communist Party first, or was a more ardent Communist. Some support for that. There's no support at all that she was the mastermind of this conspiracy, but that's how, that's a sort of sexist trope, right? And that was true especially of communist women. That charge had been made about altruistic, for example, in this prosecution. So one newspaper referred to Ethel as the red spider, and she eager to dominate a man. That was literally in the article. So just, she was a victim of these kind of ideas of women at the time and communism.
Other questions?
You mentioned Alger-Hiss.
Yes.
Were there other spy trials in that period that were followed and were?
Well, sure. There was a Hiss trial. In the Rosenberg, Klaus Fuchs atomic conspiracy, the other defendants, like Harry Gold, pled guilty. So there were not other trials arising out of this conspiracy. There was a trial shortly before the Rosenberg case of a guy named Abe Rothman, who was not tried for espionage because they couldn't prove that. They tried him for perjury in the grand jury. And he convicted, and in fact, Judge Kaufman presided over that case, which was prosecuted by the same U.S. Attorney's Office and by Floyd Cohn. So they all viewed it, Floyd Cohn viewed it as what he called the trial run for the Rosenberg case. And that's how Kaufman wanted the Rosenberg case badly, because he saw that it was a career maker. And so he reached out to get the Rosenberg case, and the way he did that was by saying, look, I already tried this related case, the Brockman case. The other one I would point to, the famous one is the Smith Act trial of all the communist leaders in New York City. That happened before the Rosenberg case, but I think that's part of why Judge Kaufman wanted this trial so badly, because the judge in the prosecution of communist top officials under the Smith Act, that judge's name was Harold Medina. He was a long-time Second Circuit judge as well, or at that time, district judge. And Harold Medina became a kind of national hero from that trial. That was a very different kind of trial. It went on for months. It was much more like the Chicago Sept trial in that their lawyers tried, many lawyers, or many of them on trial, their lawyers tried to make it a theater and sort of embarrass the judge and embarrass the proceedings. But Medina became a sort of national hero, and I think Kaufman sort of saw the opportunity there and wanted the same thing. So those are the trials I'm just looking with. Obviously, with McCarthyism, there are lots of other like loyalty board proceedings and things around. Again, like you see them in the around the country, but the big trials, I think those are yeah.
So, how do you think Judge Kaufman perceived his own legacy in terms of, was his life's work a redemption for what he done?
Yeah.
Or did he see it as simply consistent across eras?
I think he would see it as consistent. So the kind of notion in the book, the kind of riddle I'm posing at the beginning is this contradiction. How did this guy, his notorious executions, then become a liberal life? You would probably reject that kind of framing and think that he'd been consistent. And of course, like Truman, as an example, and Truman's the one who appointed him. You can be an anti-communist liberal. It's more that he became a sort of anti-statist and turned against, so hand in glove with the prosecution to the point of these ex parte communications, not just in the Rosenberg trial, but in others. That for him to become, a prison reformer and a critic of the FBI's wiretapping programs, as he was in some later cases, and other areas where he was really a civil libertarian, even in national security related cases. One of his famous decisions was to make conscientious objection open not just to religious objectors, but to anyone who had a philosophical, really sort of butchering the statute in the process, but doing that, and that was eventually upheld once that perhaps by the Supreme Court. So I think you're right. We would not have necessarily seen this inconsistency that I'm highlighting. In terms of how he wanted to be perceived, so there was a story that appeared in his obituary where he was interviewing a law clerk, a potential law clerk, and he told that potential law clerk that he knew the word Rosenberg would be in the title of his obituary. And he clearly was saying that with unease and with unhappiness. So it's absolutely right. He wanted to be known for much more than the Rosenberg case. And there was a profile. This is, again, the Greenhouse wrote a profile of him in 1982 that dredged up some of the Rosenberg controversy that had happened in the 70s and stuff about the case. So otherwise, a glowing profile. It was a profile because he was about to helm the President's Commission on Organized Crime under Reagan in 1980. So Kaufman didn't like that profile, and he fired off like a 4-page, single-space letter to the editor of the New York Times, who he knew personally, but this wasn't like to the paper, this was like the guy he knew personally, just complaining vehemently about this profile and how, look at all the great stuff he's done since then, it was overlooked, and how could, why is it there? Why does it focus on the Rosenberg case? Even though there were only 2 sentences. So a kind of ultimate victory for him, I think, is that the final headline of the obituary was Judge Kaufman, I know, just paraphrasing here, it was Irvin R. Kaufman of Rosenberg spy trial, and free press rulings. So he got a little bit in there, like he got some of the liberalism in there, and not just the Rosenberg case. He would have been happy with that. But I don't think he expected better. Really. He knew that was coming.
Anything?
Yeah.
Do you have any contact with the Kaufman family, and what has their reaction been to your book?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I did. Unfortunately, by the time I was really doing this in earnest, his sons had died. As I mentioned in the prologue, 2 sons died before he did, but there was a 3rd son who died around 2010 or something. I never got to speak to him, and that was one of the sons who really had mental illness issues and other things. But there were grandkids. That person, that 3rd son who survived longer, his son, is someone who I got to know in the course of doing this, because he was the family member who was kind of the keeper of all the family photo albums and correspondence and cards and things like that. So he's a super nice person. Let me go camp out in his basement, go through all those files. I interviewed him repeatedly about the family. And there were other relatives. He had a cousin, also a grandson, who there was a sort of niece by marriage who was a professor at Barnard who knew the family well. That was a great source. There was a daughter-in-law. His first son who died in 1977 as a young man. His wife is living and was very cooperative and helpful. In terms of how they view it, that first grandson I mentioned is most involved in the project, and who I've talked to most about that, and who's read the book since, is really great. I mean, he would say they themselves had a sort of often positive, often negative relationship with their grandfather. He's quoted in the book, and I think the gist of the quote is something like, "We have a lot to be thankful for and some stuff to be angry about," because he was a very difficult taskmaster with their parents, not so much with them as grandkids, but with his own sons. And that they themselves, the family, has the perception that really corroded their lives and the family's life in general. So there's some resentment, if that's the right word, there. But there also was a lot of interest in his legacy and in the case, and he said to me, I didn't know all this other stuff. He knew about the Rosenberg case. He didn't know all the other civil liberties related decisions that are really path-breaking, and if you're on my side of the spectrum, you like those decisions, and he is, and he does. So I think it's eye-opening in that respect for them. They thought it was, I was gratified because he thought it was a fair treatment, which certainly what I set out to do. So.
Any other questions?